Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to ASA's bonus webinar. Today we're discussing California's Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulations. These initiatives set California on the path to zero emissions by 2035. CARB requires manufacturers to provide service information for electric vehicles, and zero-emission vehicles will be required to have standardized onboard diagnostic systems. So what does all this mean for independent repair shops like yours across the country? I'm Jillian Fry, ASA's Director of Marketing and Communications, and I'm your host today. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Bob Redding, and his special guest, Steve Douglas. Bob is our man on the Hill, ASA's full-time representative in Washington, D.C., who stays on top of legislation affecting our industry at the federal and state levels. Steve is the Vice President of Energy and Environment with Alliance for Automotive Innovation. He works extensively on environmental regulations with both the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, and US EPA, including zero-emission vehicles, California's low-emission vehicle program, US EPA's Tier 3, and onboard diagnostics. Before I let Bob and Steve get started, just a few notes about today's webinar. You are in listen-only mode, and if you dialed in by phone, please select telephone from the prompts and enter your audio pin in the audio panel to eliminate echo and feedback during the webinar. If you have any questions during the first portion, please type them into the question area on your screen. My teammate Tricia and I will help you if we can, or we'll save it for our experts during the Q&A period at the end of the webinar. And now then, Bob and Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jillian.
Okay. Thanks, Jillian, and thanks to all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Bob Redding, ASA's Washington, D.C. representative. We're very pleased to have Steve Douglas, Vice President of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, to join us today. Welcome, Steve. As many of you know, the California Air Resources Board, near the end of August, approved a very important rule, the Advanced Clean Cars 2, for the motoring public and the automotive industry. And this will be our topic for today's webinar. When we completed our discussion, there will be questions at the end you'll be able to submit, and they'll walk you through that when we wrap up. Before we get into the most recent action in California, what's your history with independent shops and service information issues, Steve? You've been around a long time and you've been through a lot of battles.
Well, thanks, Bob. And I have to tell you what a pleasure it is to talk to you today. I think we've known each other and been working together for well over 20 years now. I think we started when we were young teenagers. But so just a little history on how we got together and how we've been working together. So for myself, I've spent the last 27 years working for the car companies in California on virtually every vehicle emission regulation that's been adopted. So everything from tailpipe exhaust to evaporative emissions to the California's zero-emission vehicle or ZEV mandate, and of course, as Jillian said, the onboard diagnostic regulations, and that's kind of what led me here. So a little background on how we got here and how we started working together, and it starts back in the early 80s. So car companies started using computers to monitor and adjust various engine parameters. And of course, when automakers start doing things, the regulators take notice. So the regulatory agencies realize that these onboard computers and sensors, they could also monitor and improve vehicle emissions. So in '87, CARB first required onboard diagnostic systems on all vehicles. So these became known as OBD1, Onboard Diagnostics 1. And then over the next several years, computer technology in vehicles evolved as pretty rapidly, just like personal computers and computer networks did. So in 1996, CARB upped the ante to OBD requirements, and they required OBD2 on all vehicles. And these requirements ensure, of course, a few things. First, they monitor vehicle emissions, and they notify the driver if there's an issue. So that's the check engine light. It also stores information about any malfunction. So if a malfunction is identified, they store all of the vehicle parameters at the time, and that allows technicians to ideally quickly and accurately diagnose the problem and repair the vehicle, get it back on the road with lower emissions. But computers enabled a lot more than just monitoring and reporting emission malfunctions by very precisely controlling the fuel, the air, the spark. They allowed car companies to dramatically reduce emissions to levels that were just unthinkable just a few years earlier. So, but computers also enabled safety improvements like analog brakes, traction control, airbag deployment, all these things. They save thousands of lives every single year. So as the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, computers were completely integrated into virtually every vehicle component on the vehicle. So body controllers, climate control, computers were just integral to the operation of the vehicle. And all of this was for the better. So we had safer, cleaner, more efficient, and more reliable cars and trucks. It was all for the better, except for at the most critical time when the technology was changing at its fastest pace. Communications between the automakers and independent repair shops kind of broke down. And I like to think this failure was through no fault of either the car companies or the independent repair shops. The automakers, they were all busy developing, implementing new technology. Independent repair shops were busy fixing the older technology. But at some point, right before the turn of the century, the old met new, and with only limited communications between the aftermarket and the OEMs, there was a breakdown. So I will say, and I was around during this time, automakers, we believed that independent repair shops had the necessary service information. US EPA had a regulation, and it required automakers to provide a list of all the emission-related information on what was the Fed World website. So if you had a 1984 Ford Taurus, you could look on the Fed World website and see what exhaust emission related. Now, it didn't provide anything. It just said, hey, there's a document on vehicle exhaust. So, and there was even a requirement in California that there was always a requirement that you could overnight that information, but then CARB added a requirement that you could fax that 32 or 57 page document, and that's super helpful. So we were a bit dumbfounded when independent technicians in Arizona in 1999, they introduced legislation about repair. So that started, so that was in February of 1990, and we had this meeting, and we thought, well, we provide all the information, and so what could possibly be the problem? And that kind of was the problem. There wasn't any discussion between the independent repair shops and the automakers. So we started what we call the Arizona pilot program in Arizona, and what we found, and this is also where ASA came into play, because I think it was Dave Lansbury who headed up the work there, or one of the people that headed up the work there. But what we found was that from an OEM standpoint, it's not enough to have information in a warehouse on a shelf, even if you can overnight deliver it or fax a copy. And so we worked with ASA in 2000, 2001 to get that information in a way that it was accessible to the aftermarket. So we put it online, but we learned something more too, and that's that the EPA, the CARB regulations, they apply to emission related, so exhaust, evap, all that stuff. But what we learned was, well, that's clearly not enough. right? You have to have access to both emission and non-emission related, because independents do and have repaired and maintained vehicles and all the systems on vehicles, from brakes to climate, body controllers, all of that. And when technology is changing as fast as it is, then you really need access to the whole broad spectrum of information. So that's what we learned, and that's where Bob and I, right around the turn of the century, which makes us seem older than we clearly are, that's where we came into play. And we also realized, of course, that Arizona is not unique, and so that's where ASA kind of took on the role of ensuring that technicians have the information and the tools that they need nationwide. And so that's kind of my that's how I've been working with the aftermarket with ASA for the last 23 years now. And that was a very long answer, Bob.
It's a lot of miles between, and a lot of miles on this issue between that point. And thanks for the shout out for Dave Lansbury. He's passed away now, but Dave really put a lot of hours and thought into this early process, and was great help, and should be a hero on service information for techs and shops. Is a hero. Okay, let's fast forward to what we saw, I guess, the last week of August with CARB, California Air Resources Board's action on the new rule, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. Give us a snapshot of the history behind that particular rule and the Alliance's role in the process.
All right. Well, I feel like the last answer was covering 20 years in real time.
Right.
But so actually, I'm going to go back further in history. So this is long before Bob and I, but from the late 60s, CARB has always regulated criteria emissions. They were the first ones to start it. So they have always had exhaust emissions and ultimately evaporative emissions, things like that. So if you then fast forward to 1990, Roger Smith, the CEO of General Motors, introduced the GM Impact. It was a concept car. It was the world's first electric car, and that was in January of 1990. That vehicle got so much media attention, so much attention from the general public that Roger Smith then announced, hey, we're going into production with this GM Impact in April of 1990. Well, the California Air Resources Board, CARB being CARB, they said, hey, if one company can build one vehicle, then all companies can build 10% of their products as electric vehicles. And so CARB added in the September 1990 low emission vehicle clean fuel regulation, they added two sentences which said, hey, you have to make 10% of your vehicles as electric vehicles. So that meant starting in 1990 that we had both criteria emissions, exhaust evap, things like that, and zero emission vehicle requirements. So then in 2004, CARB added greenhouse gas regulation. So that's CO2 tailpipe exhaust, CO2, so fuel economy effectively. And so that's where we are today. We have greenhouse gas criteria and ZEV, and that's all part of California's programs. And of course, obviously, OBD. So in 2012, CARB adopted Advanced Clean Cars 1, and that incorporated all of them under one regulation. So just last month, in fact, just 2-3 weeks ago, they adopted Advanced Clean Cars 2. ACC2 doesn't change the greenhouse gas regulations. They'll get into that later. But it made just minimal changes to criteria because cars are almost zero emitting as it is if they're running properly. But it was a pretty dramatic change to the zero emission vehicle requirements. And just like with every regulation over the last quarter century, we worked constructively and cooperatively with CARB and the other stakeholders for a couple of years at least, developing these ACC2 regulations, which again, they cover criteria, they cover ZEV, and we're always involved. We never get everything we want and rarely get anything we want, but we try to work, cooperatively with them to the best that we can. So that's
Well,
where
thank you
we're
for
at.
that. And that kind of gets us to the rule. And we've seen a lot in the media about 2035 and this sort of thing in the mainstream media. Um, you're a consumer in California or maybe other states, but you're a consumer in California today. What does this mean for you and daily life, vehicles, and that sort of thing?
So that's a great question, Bob. So in 3 years, in 2026, California's ACC2 will require 35% of new vehicles sold via electric vehicles. And by electric vehicles, I mean plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, or fuel cell electric vehicles. So from a consumer standpoint, that means that for every 2 gasoline vehicles that are sold, 1 electric vehicle has to be sold. So that's just 3 years away. And 2 years after that, you lose one of the gasoline vehicles. So now it's just 1-to-1. So every time you sell an electric vehicle, every time you sell a gasoline vehicle, you have to sell an electric vehicle. So the 2035, that's great, but that's way out there. The impact is now. So in 28, it's a 1-to-1. In 31, so 3 years after that, every time you sell 1 gasoline car, you have to sell 3 electric cars. So those are extraordinarily aggressive requirements, even in California. So today we're selling about 16% electric vehicles this year, 13.5% last year in California. No other state is close to that. But when you look at it, the EV prices are very high. So we looked at Kelley Blue Book, and like last month, the average electric vehicle price was $67,000. So what that tells us is these are fairly, on average, there are certainly cheaper cars, on average, these are fairly affluent people who have upgraded electrical. They live in single family homes. They can charge their vehicles at home. That's not a cross section of new vehicle buyers, let alone the average public. So, these are fairly expensive cars. And if we want to get to 35, 50, 70, 100%, we have to expand that universe.
Well, thank you for that. And now let's move to the red meat because we got a lot of shops that are on today, and we've got a lot of shops that are going to hear this later, and technicians. What does the new CARB rule mean for independent auto repair shops? This is a critical piece, and I know you know a great deal about this.
Well, there's kind of 2 things that are critical to this for independent repair shops. Obviously, the first is electric vehicles are coming, and they're coming in a very big way, and in the next few years. The other element of this is that there's a lot. I think there will be a need to keep vehicles on the road longer, and that means gasoline vehicles, and that means maintaining the vehicles that are out there now that will be sold in the next 10 years, 12 years before we hit that threshold. So I think, maintaining the vehicles up to date and repairing those vehicles, those gasoline vehicles, is critical. Then the other element of that is plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. They can account for up to 20% of the vehicles, even out, 2035 and beyond. So those are still, plug-in hybrids. They'll go 50 miles on electric, and then they switch over to gasoline, and those are incredibly complex vehicles because you're managing not just the electric motor, the battery, and all of the systems around those, because there's a lot of battery control systems, to maintain the battery cooling, and the motor and the inverters. So there's a a lot of technology just on the electric side, but now you throw a gasoline vehicle into the mix, or a gasoline engine, and it makes it much more complicated as well. So those are, so that's kind of the three areas: the obviously electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and then plug-in hybrids, which are complicated, and then finally just maintaining, repairing those gasoline vehicles that exist today, because I think they're going to be out there for a very long time.
Okay. I've heard forever, we all have, that what starts in California moves east. Impact beyond California. What does it look like?
Well, there you go. That's another. So to begin with, there's kind of two areas where this is going to impact the rest of the country. The first is that there are currently 15 states which have adopted California standards. Those 15 states make up about 35% of the new vehicle market. So it's a huge portion of the US market that is covered by California, that is regulated by California. Will all of those states adopt ACC2? They won't. A few of them will drop off, but I imagine that. And so I know, like, Virginia's governor and Maine's governor have said that they probably will not adopt ACC2, and other states are looking at it. But even still, I expect kind of the majority of those states to follow California and ACC2. So you're looking at, I don't know, somewhere around 30% of the US market that will adopt and follow exactly California. But it's bigger than that, right? The federal government, US EPA, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, EPA sets greenhouse gas standards for all cars, and they set it nationwide. and NHTSA sets CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards. And so they have, the president issued an executive order last year that first established a target of 50% electric vehicles by 2030, and then directed EPA and NHTSA to issue draft regulations this coming March and issue final regulations by March of 2024. And maybe it just said the final regulations, but we expect draft regulations this coming March. So they're off writing regulations now, probably. And you can control the number of electric vehicles by what you set the greenhouse gas standards at. So if greenhouse gas standards are 0, then every vehicle, tailpipe greenhouse gas, so CO2 emissions is 0, every vehicle has to be electric or fuel cell. And then likewise with fuel economy, if you set the fuel economy standard at 300 miles per gallon, then everything has to be electric. So that's the way the federal government in all 50 states is probably going to force electrification. And if you're guessing, you can imagine that EPA will probably and NHTSA will probably set standards that at least come close to their boss's boss, his target of 50% ZEV. So I think this is coming. And I'll also say that the industry, the manufacturers, are moving towards electric vehicles. ACC2, California or not, there is a big movement towards electric vehicles across the industry, and it's not just in the US, it's globally. So I think we've committed to spend, the auto companies have committed to spend $515 billion by 2030 on electrification. So it's a real commitment. It's real money. So with or without the regulations, this is where we're headed.
That's quite a commitment. Steve, when you did your historical and listening to you now, have you seen this pattern where emissions information for shops going back to the 90 Clean Air Act amendments and moving through Arizona pilot is addressed first and then non-emissions dealt with? Is any of this a pattern to you? Are you seeing it that way?
Absolutely. And I think the issue has been, and Bob, you've been, and ASA has been at the forefront of all of this, that the regulators, CARB and EPA, adopt emission regulations. But again, what we found in the pilot program was that, and I think what every independent shop already knows, is like, okay, well, that's good, and that's a big chunk of information. but it's not enough. And so the regulators adopt regulations, and then we have committed, and Bob, you and ASA were right in the thick of this, to also provide the non-emission related, so ABS, things like that, subsequent to the emissions. So that is historically how we've been, how we've operated, and it's just a kind of a follow-on of the way the regulatory system is set up.
All right, I'm down to my last question, and then we'll open it up, and Jillian will help us out here. If you owned an auto repair shop in a state other than California, how would you view CARB's action for your shop? I'm in Texas, and this has all happened, and I'm saying, well, that's California, I'm not worrying about it. How would you look at it if you were a shop owner and you know what you know?
I don't think there's going to be a vast difference between California and the rest of the country. I think we'll see what comes out of EPA and NHTSA next year, particularly EPA, next year. But I don't expect a vast difference. I think electric vehicles are coming. So whether you're, maybe if you're in Texas, you're a year or two behind. But I think most of this, or maybe even 3. But from a shop standpoint, I think this direction that we're headed is we're going this way. And like I say, even without the regulations, I think we're headed in this direction because it's a global issue.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Now we're going to open it up for questions. Jillian, do we have any coming in?
We certainly do. Thanks, gentlemen. And listeners, before I start with the few I have, now's your opportunity to have your questions answered. If you have any, please type them into the question area on your screen. Here's the first one that came in during the webinar. Are the California goals realistic based on projected sales of EV versus gasoline vehicles in the time frame you've mentioned? And does the projected sales data support the transition timeline?
That is, I assume that's for me. That's that's a really great question, and I think it's one that we ask ourselves. It's really difficult to judge right now. I think, and when I say it's difficult to judge right now, I'm talking about California, because again, we're at 16% sales, and those are actually very expensive cars. So you're talking about 16% of the vehicles are 67,000 and on average. So how does that translate into 35%? So you're more than doubling the sale of those vehicles. You can't do that with $67,000 vehicles. That's so. How do you develop the mainstream? And not only that, when you're talking about electric vehicles that are plugged in, you have to think, okay, where do they plug in at? I mean, if you go to apartment buildings, if you go to low-income neighborhoods, if you go to places that have street parking, where are those people going to fuel the vehicle? So I think from our standpoint, we looked a couple of years ago and we said, okay, what does it take to get to kind of mainstream adoption? And it was infrastructure. You have to have the infrastructure to do this. And we're way behind, both residential, public infrastructure, and we're way behind on that. So we have to catch up on that. You need the cost. You have to get the vehicle cost down so that the average price isn't $70,000 almost, and you have to get the cost of the fuel down. So hydrogen's still very expensive, and in some cases, electricity can be expensive, more in California than in most states. And then, but the production, that's another big issue, and this is the manufacturer's concern. It's like, okay, if you look out to 2035 and you say, okay, we meet all of our targets and goals, how many vehicles are produced? That's somewhere between 70 and 100 million electric vehicles, just in the light duty, just in the US. So where do we get the critical minerals, the lithium, the nickel, the manganese? Where do we get those to support that level of vehicles? Because you can't, despite what some people say, you can't recycle your way out of that. So how do you get that? So And right now, most of it, and the bottom line is you have to mine the minerals, and that can take a decade or more to. So, I look at the Thatcher mine and a lithium mine in Nevada, and Thatcher Pass lithium mine, and they cited that in 1973. They got approval last, I think this year actually, earlier this year, in the permitting. So I'm not saying that everything will take that long, or that it did take 50 years, but it's a long lead time. You don't permit. So we need to figure out where we want to be in 2035 and say, what do we need today to support tomorrow? So yeah, it's a very valid question. In California, it's very, very challenging. In other states, it may not be achievable. Certainly companies do what they can to meet the requirements, but it will be difficult.
And that, the discussion of the infrastructure, that's what a lot of the questions are that are coming in. One is just, will even California's electrical system be able to handle the load of these millions of electric vehicles just in the short time frame?
Another great question. I think on you look at it kind of two ways. The grid as a whole, right? So could California's grid? Well, probably so, because you typically charge an electric vehicle at night. So you can program the vehicle, the charger to plug between midnight and 6 a.m. And then the load is pretty low then. And so that's okay. The bigger issue is probably from a local standpoint. Where do you get locally? So like if you look at a DC fast charge station, if you have 3 or 4 outlets, that's the equivalent power of a high-rise office building. So when you start throwing these DC fast charge stations along the interstate, you're talking about putting in, the equivalent of, high-rise office buildings throughout, and that's definitely an issue. So I think on the overall grid, I think that's will be challenging in itself. But the bigger issue is the local grid, and how will the local grid handle it? Do you need, and even if you look at like an apartment complex, it might have 500 parking spots. Okay, well now you throw 500 level 2 chargers in there, and that's a big load for any area.
Absolutely. So another popular question, what do you recommend mechanical and body shops start doing now in terms of training and infrastructure to get things started? And even for those non-California shops, how quickly do you think they need to get on top of this?
I think these vehicles are kind of phasing in, so the ramp right now is, like I say, we're nationwide, we're at 6%. So you're starting to see them, EV sales. So you're starting to see them already. And so I think it will be, and then of course it's going to step up in the next few years. So 24, 25, there's some requirements in there that lead me to believe that to the extent we can find the batteries, the critical minerals, things like that we will see a steady increase in electrification. And so yeah, so I think it's probably like any new technology that is introduced, you have to start training for that. You have to start developing the technicians, the knowledge base, and getting the tools. And of course, like I say, there'll probably be fewer repairs on these vehicles in the early stages, and then that will increase as the later stages. In the next 10 years, I would say is what you're looking at. So certainly staying on top of it now, but the real crunch time will happen in 28, 29, 2030.
Is there an estimate as to when the current gasoline fleet will drop to below 50% of the vehicles on the road?
That's a good question, a really good question. So we were looking in California, so the most aggressive scenarios, and you would look at in 2030, 25, and that's actually the last question too, probably better than I did. But you're looking at in the most aggressive scenario, being somewhere around 20% of the vehicles on the road would be electric in 2030, 20 to 25%, probably closer to 20%.
So the life expectancy of a gas vehicle is gonna extend because a lot of people may avoid the commitment to the electric vehicle. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
That's exactly what I would imagine, particularly at the prices we're seeing for electric vehicles and the dearth of infrastructure, particularly residential infrastructure. So, if you're looking at charging your vehicle at home, it's fairly inexpensive. So even in California, it's fairly inexpensive, and it's super convenient. If you have a garage, if you have a single family home, you come in, you plug the car in, it takes 2 seconds, and it's like ferries, fill it up at night, and in the morning it's full. But if you have to go and do public charging, then it's 3 times as expensive, maybe more. And it's super inconvenient. Like, who wants to trade a 5-minute stop at a gas station every couple of weeks for a 3, 4, 10 hours of sitting at a charger away from home? It's just not likely. So, until that residential infrastructure gets built out, and I don't know when that will be, I think for a lot of consumers, the gasoline vehicles are going to be on the road and a big part of it.
Okay, that certainly makes sense. So the proposed EVs are there any restrictions or suggestions or limitations as to what kind of range they should be trying to achieve in these new builds?
There's a requirement that they have a minimum of 150 miles range for battery electric vehicles. For plug-in hybrids, there's a requirement that they have a 50-mile range.
Okay.
I think what we're seeing is longer ranges, bigger batteries. So, where's the sweet spot? What makes everybody want to buy these vehicles? I don't know, is it 250 miles? Is it 300 miles? I don't think we've, as consumers or as automakers, have figured that out yet. Obviously, the longer the range, the more the batteries, the more expensive the vehicle. So that's kind of the balance.
Mm-hmm.
And also you run out of space to put batteries as well. So
Yeah, it will take a bigger vehicle.
yeah.
Is there any technology they're looking at beyond electric manufacturers?
There is. There's a fair amount of activity on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So hydrogen is just like gasoline. You plug it in, 5 minutes later it's full. It goes 350 miles. So it's just exactly like gasoline. The issue has been with hydrogen is kind of a lack of any hydrogen stations. So there in the US, there are 48 hydrogen fueling stations. 47 of those are in California. So they're great, they work. They're actually ideal for larger vehicles, for vehicles that tow, because even today, battery electric vehicles are not meant to tow. Like, you're not towing RVs, across the country with a battery electric vehicle, no matter whose it is. It's just not going to happen with the technology that we have today or foresee in the foreseeable future. So hydrogen is great for that. So hopefully there will be more. There's a number of bills at the federal level that I'm certain Bob has worked on that have reduced that will hopefully build out the hydrogen fueling along roadways for heavy duty. And of course, if you can build it for heavy duty, you can also build it for, the light duty could use that as well. So that would be very helpful.
Another question, when can the repair industry expect standardized diagnostics, scan tooling, SI, universal codes, etc., in the EV market that will be similar to what we have on existing platforms?
2026 is what we're looking at. There's a regulation. It was, I forget what number it was, 1962.5. That was part of ACC2 that required data standardization. We supported that, and so it would require that there's standardized data that's output over a J1962 port. So your standard OBD port, every vehicle will have to come with a standard OBD port. And again, I talked with ASA and Bob several years ago, and we supported this change so that it would be identical to the existing vehicles. This data standardization, obviously, the CARB doesn't regulate. CARB regulates emissions, and it's a little bit strange because there are no emissions associated with the electric vehicles. So, but they do have a lot of standardized data requirements, and I think the people at CARB, the regulators, were, they wanted to make sure that these vehicles could be repaired by technicians, and those technicians, whether they're dealers, and I think there's a recognition, certainly from our standpoint, that the overwhelming majority of off-warranty repairs are conducted by independent repair shops. So it's important to, one, provide the information to repair vehicles to all technicians, and certainly, since most of the repairs will be conducted by the aftermarket, to make sure that that's available to the aftermarket as well.
Thank you. You mentioned that automakers have made a $515 billion commitment to meet EV demand. Do you think that that's enough of an investment to be all electric new vehicles by 2035?
Well, clearly not, because that only gets us to 2030, and at best that's 50%. So that's kind of gets us to the starting gate. So yeah, no, I think it will require more investment, and will things get cheaper? Yes, they will. And if I look historically, these numbers have just jumped every single time. I think 25, it was it 300 billion, and then by 2030 another 200 billion. So yeah, I think it's going to require more and more investment. So I don't think 515 will get us to the finish line. And to keep in mind, that's also just the automakers that are that the investment from public will be from public, from government, for infrastructure, for education, things like that. That's going to be even more, and of course from the utilities, from electric vehicle supply, the charger companies. That's all going to be very, very significant. So yeah, it's a small part.
Yeah. Comment and a question. I've heard that the cost to the environment is huge to create the batteries for the EVs. Is the government funding research for alternative methods that don't tax the environment while trying to protect it?
Good question, and it's fair. I think, and I'm not an expert in the environmental impact. From what I understand, there is a significant, environmental impact, not just from mining, but also from the actual production, the processing of the critical minerals for batteries. This is an interesting question, because what are you on the mining side, there is concerns with mines, the environmental impact of mines, and the worker conditions at mines. But there's this problem that everyone wants electric vehicles, but no one wants to mine electric, the critical minerals needed for the batteries on those, and yet you have to, right? You have to dig. You can either dig in Alaska, or you can dig in the Congo. You can dig in Nevada, or you can dig in Chile. You can dig in Michigan, or you can dig in Russia. But you have to dig. And so what does the country want? And that's what I was saying, you have to start in 2035 and work your way backwards. Okay, do you want the mining to take place in another country with perhaps a lot fewer environmental requirements and regulations around those? Or do you want them to take place in the US, where we have environmental requirements, we have worker protections, but you have to do that because there's kind of no alternative. So there's a lot of discussion. I know our companies are very concerned about ensuring, the environmental integrity of batteries as well as worker protections. So they are doing that, and of course the government is as well. So I think there's that on kind of the environmental side. There's also the CO2 emissions. I think you overcome the CO2 penalty that you have with building an electric vehicle over the life of the vehicle. So, it's certainly more CO2 emissions associated with building an electric vehicle, producing an electric vehicle than a gas, but you make up for that in, I don't know, the first 30,000 miles of operation.
Okay. Folks, I want to let you know you've got a couple more minutes left to ask questions. If anyone has any others, you've been very thorough, Steve, so I don't know. Did y'all have anything else you wanted to address that came up with any of these questions? Bob or Steve?
No, I think Steve did a great job. He might have another comment or two, but really appreciate him being here today. Steve?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really appreciate being invited, Bob. I mean, it's super helpful. We have had a decades long partnership, and we certainly appreciate that, and we appreciate that. Like I said, the aftermarket does, the independent repair shops that you and ASA represent. You do most of the repairs, the majority of repairs, so it's critical. And I think, if we've learned anything over the decades, it's that keeping this communication open, keeping the dialogue going is critical for it's as important or more important for the OEMs as it is for the independent repair shops. And this is, things are not slowing down. I thought, the turn of the century, we're getting computers in cars. That's the end of it. And then we had those 24-pin dot matrix printers, and I thought that's perfect. It's near letter quality. But here we are, and it's kind of the whole spectrum, right? It's not just, we are in the middle of a transition. It's not just the engines that will power the car, but who or what drives the cars. Autonomous vehicle technology is coming. It's coming fairly fast, and so I think, if anything, our partnership needs to be stronger today than it has been in the past, because we really, neither side can make it without the other. So again, I certainly appreciate your work over the years and the work of all of your folks. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of great information, and I know I really appreciated that I was able to understand all of it. So thank you, Steve. And thank you both, Bob and Steve, for sharing this information with us that reflects such a big change coming for our industry. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up with a few details about what's going on at ASA, but just thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Listeners, before you leave today, I want to remind you to join us next week on Webinar Wednesday. Our special guest, Jimmy Lee, the product evangelist for Kukui, will join us to share tips for improving your shop's word-of-mouth marketing and increasing your Google ranking. Jimmy is an energetic wealth of information, so please register today and join us next Wednesday, the 21st, at this same time, noon Central. ASA's next members-only shop-to-shop is on Wednesday, October 5th at 7 p.m. Central. Join our guest host, Jeff Buckley, and moderator John Firm in a roundtable style discussion about team recruiting, training, and retention, things that many shops are struggling with in the current employment market. Jeff and John have a slew of special guests joining them, folks that have found solutions, and they want to share their knowledge and talk about your experiences as well. So bring your ideas and your questions, and go ahead and register today to join them. Again, that'll be on Wednesday, October 5th. And I could spend an hour just talking about ASA's training circuit. It's coming up live in Charlotte, North Carolina on Saturday, October 8th. That is a full day event, and you do not want to miss it. Our friends from Jasper and AutoZone will be there, along with 9 of the top trainers from across the country, teaching 7 unique courses, including a full day of hands-on EV training. We all know how timely that is. Let me save some time just now, so y'all head to ASA Training Circuit website so you can register and get it on your schedule. That's asashop.org/training-circuit. You do not want to miss that training event coming up in Charlotte, Saturday, October 8th. And finally, as always, ASA members can watch this and any other webinar at your convenience, 24/7, 365. If you're not a member, we would love for you to join ASA and make our one voice even stronger. Membership is less than $1 a day, and membership dues directly support Bob Redding's work on behalf of independent shop owners like you across the country. Learn more about the benefits of membership at asashop.org. And so again, I want to thank you for joining Bob and Steve, Tricia, and myself today. Enjoy your weekend, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.